Hi everyone and welcome to today's Geobites presentation on COP26 and COVID-19, Global Drivers of Local Change. My name is Zoe Lee and I am one of the school's college liaison assistants here at the University of Chester, and today I am joined by Dr. Rebecca Collins, who will be running today's Geobites presentation for you. Just want to say hello, Rebecca.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us.
Perfect, thank you. You will see her shortly anyway. She'll be able to introduce herself a little bit further as well. We do also have Stacey here who will be moderating any questions as they come in. Would you like to say hello, Stacey?
Hi everyone.
Perfect, thank you very much. So as I said, I'll shortly be handing over to Rebecca for the presentation, and during the presentation you will be given the opportunity to ask questions and also get involved in some activities via links that we will put up in the chat function, so please feel free to get involved in those. You can do that anonymously as well if you wish to. If you want to put any questions in anonymously, you just need to click that you want to be anonymous. So you can also like other people's questions that they come in as well, just to indicate that you're interested so that we can get to those before any of the other ones, just in case we get loads through and we can't get through them all. We'll go to the ones that have been liked most at the start. And then at the end of the session, Stacey will collate any of these questions and ask them to Rebecca at the end of the session. All right, so that is everything from me, I think, if we're all okay to go with you there, Rebecca.
Yeah. Ready when you are.
Perfect, there we go. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, Stacey, and thank you, all of you out there, wherever you are, for joining us all today. My name is Rebecca Collins. I'm a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Chester, and I mostly teach economic geography, cultural geography, and all kinds of things to do with sustainability. And it's all of those really that underpin what I'm talking to you about today, which is the relationship between these two pretty significant global events, one that we've been living with for a couple of years now, and another, COP26, which is a one-off event, but very much focused around something else, another big global challenge that we've been living with for a number of years, and are probably set to live with for the rest of our lifetimes, really, and that's the climate emergency. As I'm sure a lot of you know, big scholars of geography, you'll know that COP26 started recently on Sunday, in fact, up in Glasgow. And this conference, the Conference of Parties, is really being hailed as the last-ditch attempt to keep global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees or lower. Now, in recent years, there has been a huge amount of kind of activist activity, particularly on the part of younger generations. This has been built through things like the Fridays for Future school strikes campaigns, some of which you may have participated in. And at COP26, young people are really maintaining their calls for urgent, significant action, including things like ending fossil fuel use and things like mitigation support for countries in the global south, which are really on the front line of climate change. But so far there's already been quite a bit of scepticism, unfortunately, about what COP26 is likely to be able to achieve, given that there are some global players who aren't going to be there face to face in Glasgow, and some scepticism has even been coming from the host country, the UK. Our Prime Minister has expressed a certain amount of underwhelm at the progress that's been made so far. Last week he was at the G20 meeting. The G20 is the world's 20 biggest economies. They met last week in Italy, and they met to discuss what they might be willing to commit to as part of COP26. Now, there are likely to be several reasons for this lack of commitment so far. Obviously, it's not over yet, but this lack of commitment so far to bold action, not least the ongoing effects of COVID-19, this global pandemic. Because as far as world leaders tend to be concerned, recovering from the negative economic impacts of the pandemic by growing or regrowing national economies quickly, that tends to be seen, or it has been seen so far, as being more pressing than action on the climate emergency. Now, we might disagree with that on the basis that we can see that climate change is happening in lots of different places, in lots of different ways, and it has been for years. But in terms of the way that national government economic priorities tend to be framed, it's a bit more reactionary. But having said that, there are some quite influential voices that are arguing that both can be achieved if economic growth can be delivered via commitment to things like renewable energies. And actually, just in the last few hours, I've been keeping up with the news ahead of this Geobite. There has been commitment from a lot of the biggest economies to move rapidly towards green technologies for mobility, for energy, sustainable farming, and others. So have a look at headline news later today for more on that. So economic growth can be delivered through these things like commitment to renewable energies, or also things like closed loop or circular systems of production. And one of the figures that in recent news broadcasts has really been calling for this is this gentleman, a guy called Nigel Topping. He was appointed by the UK government as their own high-level climate action champion. That's his title for COP26. And prior to that, he was executive director of an organisation called the Carbon Disclosure Project. And prior to that, had been kind of working in kind of global production. So he's got quite a lot of influence, and he himself was kind of sceptical, but in quite in a way that was very much interpreted to be giving the UK government a bit of a boot at the backside, certainly when I saw him on Channel 4 News the other night. So it's fine to say that some of the most powerful figures at COP26, particularly the governments of global north countries and some of the bigger emerging economies, see that there or perceive there to be a significant tension between economic recovery from COVID-19 on the one hand, and acting swiftly on the climate emergency on the other. In some quarters, there's a belief that the two can't be addressed at the same time, or at least not with equal speed or equal urgency. But a lot of citizens, world citizens, have a different view. Last week, there was a big poll conducted by YouGov, who you might have heard of. They're a sort of national polling organisation, and a think tank called Global Future. And their survey, which they did intentionally just before COP26, suggested that a huge majority of people believe that climate change is going to have a much more significant effect on humanity than COVID-19 in the grand scheme of things. Now, if we think back to summer 2020, which might feel like a lifetime ago, back in the early stages of the pandemic, at least in the UK, national and global governments were already at that point starting to use phrases like green recovery to describe what economies could be on the back of the pandemic. So back then, there was a sense of, if not optimism, the fact that the pandemic could be an opportunity for something like a global reset, a reset of the whole global economy, not least in terms of our relationship with the natural world, but also our relationship to these consumer-based economies that we are so unthinkingly used to. In other words, we could potentially have a global economy that starts to take more credible account of the need for us all to live and operate within planetary limits. So what I'm talking about in this Geobite is what we can learn from the pandemic experience, and particularly from the responses at a much more local level. What can we learn from response at a local level to help build resilience to climate change, both at these local levels, but also what can we learn from that local level to then scale up to national and global levels, national and global levels, let me say that again, of resilience planning. So as part of that, we'll touch on how our relationship to specific places might have changed as a result of the constraints that we have all collectively had to live through over the last year and a half. So let's have a little bit of audience participation at this early stage. I think Zoe or Stacey's going to post in the chat a link to a little online poll, and I would love for you. Sorry?
The link's gone in there for you.
Oh, brilliant, thank you. On that poll, I would first like you to answer this question, which hopefully is the only question that you can see when you click on that link. During periods of lockdown, and we've had a few, so whichever period you can remember, during that period, what were you doing differently in your everyday life that you think might inadvertently have had positive knock-on effects for the environment? So what did the pandemic mean you had to do differently that you think, okay, well, the environment has probably benefited from me doing that thing differently? So I'm going to pause for a moment because this is going to require you to do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of typing.
Yeah, sometimes we're on a bit of a delay as well with the live, so it might be nice for us to have a little discussion anyway.
Yeah.
I was going to say, for me, one of the things, maybe not that I had to do, but I felt safer doing, was walking to my local grocery store rather than going to a big supermarket.
Yeah.
And I live so close to one and don't often go there, whereas now I'm there more often than I ever have been before. And it was a nice thing to be able to talk to someone rather than just being a machine on a self-service. So that's one reason why I've carried on going, because it's actually been a really nice experience.
That's really interesting. Can I ask though, what is it about the safety? Because you said you felt safer.
Yeah, so because it's smaller and there was less people around, and quite often they would set up like a table at the door so you didn't have to go in. They would just set up, ask you what you wanted, and then they'd go in, get your stuff for you and bring you out.
Right. Yeah, good stuff. Thank you. Thank you for getting the ball rolling with that. We've got some responses coming in, which is super. And both of the examples that have come in first relate to getting around. So walking more rather than using public transport, driving much less, saving a fortune, not commuting, working remotely. Yeah, I think those are really kind of common experiences that people have reported. I'm going to share a few examples now of keep your responses coming in, because it'll be really interesting to look through them later. And do also feel free, if it works better for you, to just post them in the chat rather than via the link, if that's easier. So things that other people have been kind of reporting. So this one we've mentioned already. That's come out via some of the ideas that have been posted already. Getting around. We weren't able to travel as far, which meant there was perhaps less need for us to jump into any form of motorised transport. So getting around literally under our own steam on foot, or sometimes with some people on bikes, we were getting around differently and maybe going to different places as a result as well. Our entire world to do with food changed, or it did for a lot of people. Supply chains, global supply chains, didn't really hold up early on in the pandemic, which I think brought into sharp relief for a lot of people how dependent we are on the global movement of stuff. So getting food, or the food that we're used to, that changed. And perhaps that prompted thinking more about the amount of food that we waste as well, so making our food go further because it was harder to get it in the first place. For some people also that prompted having a go at growing their own as well. When the first lockdown started, we were just approaching the start of the summer, which was the perfect time to be having a go at growing your own carrots or tomatoes for the first time. We all are very acutely aware that we've all had to learn how to work differently and learn how to learn differently. And one of the things that a lot of kind of workplaces and educational establishments are working through now is trying to come through this and work out what is the best of both worlds to retain. So what it makes sense to do independently at home or remotely versus what it makes sense to do together. So there's more creative problem solving tasks, mutual learning. Our relationship to material stuff changed as well, or it reportedly did for some people. Some people reported buying less of some things, particularly clothing. And loads of people took the opportunity to have a really good sort out as well, clearing out things that they haven't used, whether that's clothing or something else, for a really long time. You might have noticed people on your street leaving out boxes of things on their doorstep saying free to a good home. And the importance of getting out as well and appreciating the pleasant outdoor spaces, the green spaces in our neighbourhood, whether that's a garden if we're lucky enough to have one, but neighbourhood parks, just the trees on our street sometimes, even for some people, as I happen to observe on social media, just the weeds literally kind of growing through the cracks in a pavement. So what I've been doing in my research since the start of the pandemic, working with one of my colleagues in GID, that was Catherine Welsh, as well as our wider research team, we have been looking at some of the things that changed for everyday folk like you and me since the first pandemic lockdown in the UK all the way back in March 2020. We wanted to find out in which areas of everyday life people not only were doing things differently as a result of lockdown, but once lockdown eased, what people wanted to keep doing differently from how they'd done things before COVID. And we were particularly interested in those things that people wanted to do differently that inadvertently or accidentally turned out to have net pro-environmental benefits. So were accidentally better than the environment than what they're doing previously. And what we're trying to find out is how people can be encouraged to maintain those newer, greener, climate-friendlier ways of doing things. Because our logic is to show people what they can already do, to play a part in tackling the climate emergency at a really modest scale. Because we think that by showing people what you're already doing, these new habits that you've already created, people can realise that they have got a role to play and they can start to incrementally build up other things, other kind of modest increments. So I'm going to show on the slide just a few examples, one economic example, one environmental example and one social example, all of which have come from our ongoing research into changing habits under lockdown. So my first example relates to milk. Supply chains for milk. I would say the majority of people who drink milk, especially cow's milk, will buy it in plastic bottles from a supermarket or maybe a corner shop or similar. Now, like many other kind of food and drink items, supply chains for milk didn't hold up in the early stages of the pandemic. And that prompted people to look at alternative supply chains for everyday goods. And what that meant was that we saw really big increase in something that previously was considered very old-fashioned, which was doorstep milk delivery in reusable glass bottles. This might be something that you associate, maybe not even with your parents' generation, but your grandparents' generation. So similarly, fruit and veg didn't hold up well in terms of supply chains. And what we similarly saw, like the glass milk bottles, was that people were turning to local either farm shops or local veg box delivery schemes. So things were coming to their door. So arguably it was more convenient because they were getting things often delivered literally to their door, but it was also a more local delivery scheme. And also the packaging was often reusable as well, much more less environmentally impactful than the plastic bottles, even though we can often put our plastic in the recycling. Another example might be that, or was, in terms of what our participants in our study were telling us, was that some of our outdoor spaces were somewhat taken for granted, whether that's a garden, whether that's a local park, whether that's just the trees on our street. A lot of the green spaces in our neighbourhoods were sort of subliminal. We kind of knew they were there, we kind of appreciated them, but not in a particularly direct way. Whereas the impact of the pandemic meant that actually these spaces became not just appreciated in a new way, they were cultivated. So people were planting more in their gardens, maybe making wildlife habitats, having a go at growing their own veg, and even things like street spaces as well, or shared public green spaces took on a whole new level of emphasis, and people were wanting to actively care for them more. So we were looking at these spaces that were literally on our doorstep the whole time. We're looking at them through very different eyes, because these proximate spaces literally became our entire world pretty much, for quite prolonged periods of time. And then the third example, my social example, is about neighbourhood relationships. Because our social worlds contracted as well during this time, at least in the physical sense. Obviously, the digital world kept us connected globally. If you've got family in other countries, we were able to, or friends in other countries, we were able to keep up with them through WhatsApp and Zoom and all of that. But our physical social worlds, as we all know, contracted. And in doing so, they intensified. And one of the really striking things that has come out of our research is people reporting getting to know people that they've lived on the same street with for years. People looking out for one another, actively helping one another, building a kind of social resilience, this kind of connectedness within a neighbourhood. And this is something that's really crucial in any kind of emergency response. We care more about our community's overall well-being when we know and care for the individual people within it, because we feel invested. And the same is true for the nature that we might have started noticing on our doorstep or in our garden if we have one. So ultimately what we're looking at is how we can catalyse action at local scales through these kinds of really modest but important forms of positivity. Things that have changed that we weren't going to make change, we weren't anticipating changing, but they did change because of the pandemic. And we actually appreciate things that have grown as a result of that. So can we catalyse this kind of action based on positivity rather than waiting for another emergency, whether that's something to do with the climate emergency, whether it's another pandemic, hopefully not. But it's also about showing that resilience already exists in communities when emergencies do hit. And if you live in a community that's maybe been hit by severe flooding, or you know people who've been affected by severe flooding, something arguably a direct impact of climate change, then you might have other lived experience of these kinds of things that I'm talking about. Because these kind of extreme hardships very often do bring people closer and more determined to take care of one another. And we need to extend that to our natural world too. So I'd like to ask you another question now, and I'm just going to go to my poll because I'm going to release another question. So you might need to either go back into the link or refresh it to see another question. I don't know, Zoe or Stacey, if you could just confirm that another question has become visible.
Yeah, that's all working for you. And I'm just, whilst you were there, while we get everyone on the link, some people did say in the chat that they started a milk delivery over lockdown that they hadn't done before, and also that it's so nice to see the city centre with all the tables outside, whereas before you would have to sit inside. So yep. Just to let you know that people are engaging.
Fantastic. Absolutely, that street culture, that kind of street social culture is something that had never really taken off in the UK, and it will be a whole different Geobite to unpick why that is. Maybe I'll do that one next year. But exactly, that's something that has emerged as a result of the pandemic that a lot of people are really keen to hang on to because of this kind of this relationship cultivation side of things. Brilliant. Okay. Good. So there should, as I said, be another question for you now in Slido. And what I'd love to get some thoughts from you on is whether you feel any of your relationships to places, whether somewhere really close to you on your doorstep or maybe somewhere much further away, has your relationship for that place changed for the better as a result of the pandemic? Is there anywhere that you appreciate more, perhaps. And this could be, this could be somewhere literally, I mean, I'm looking out into my garden here. I put out a lot more bird feeders over the last 18 months. That's one of the things that I think has made me look at the space of my garden a bit differently.
I definitely appreciate just having a garden more. I didn't have a garden at first. And now we moved house during just as things opened up and then shut down again. And now that we have a garden, I've spent so much time in there. Even when it's been cold, if friends have come over, we've still sat in the garden in our coats, just because it's just lovely to be outside.
Yeah, and I think I do wonder whether that's something that will stick around as well, that determination to socialise outdoors for longer into the year. We'll just put a coat on, we'll just put more layers on. We've got some answers coming in through Slido. Definitely lots of appreciation for the local green spaces that were previously taken for granted. Local walks, one audience member says, local walks enabled me to appreciate my local area and town centre. I could see changes in the wildlife from spring to summer. That is a lovely one. We've got answers talking about friends who live a long way away, but you appreciate it so much more now when you do get to see each other. Super good. Again, keep answers rolling in. Are there any appearing in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat at the moment, I don't think.
No worries. That's fine. Just wanted to check in. So what I kind of want to draw out from that question and your experiences is the impact on our personal geographies as a result of living through this pandemic, this kind of seismic global event, both in terms of the practical geographies of our lives, where we get our food from, how we get around, how we communicate with our loved ones, the spaces involved in that, but also our geographical imaginations, how we imagine our place in the world, how we understand and relate to the wider world. So I think this pandemic has had a huge influence on how we understand our relationship to place and places. And I'm just going to give a few examples of that linked to the examples that I gave on my previous slide. So the milk bottles, the outdoor space, and the friendships in neighbourhoods. So how have our relationships to place, or how might they have shifted on the back of how we get our milk differently? Well, for some people, it might have made them think a little bit more about where production happens, how production happens, and what is involved in producing our stuff. How far things travel, how far the milk travels, where the plastic or the glass travels, and how many cycles of use it can get as well. So perhaps this feeds into some people having a stronger sense of not just our environmental impacts, but our economic impacts as well. Because remember, this whole talk is about this relationship between the economic and the environmental through the lens of public health. So maybe getting a stronger sense of how we impact the different geographies that we are all part of at different scales. In terms of our relationship with the natural world, with the nature on our doorstep, some of the comments that came through in Slido really gave a sense of this valuing or even revaluing of nature. I think for me, thinking about my garden and my bird feeders, I like to think I've always cared about nature, but having more opportunity perhaps to stop and look and identify the different species that are coming to the feeder has, I think, had an impact on me and how I understand my place in the world in relation to different types of nature. But these natural spaces have also taken on other meanings as well. They've been spaces of health, spaces for our mental health, spaces for our physical health. They've been spaces for food as well, for having a go at growing your own carrots. They've become spaces of social connection. So our social world might used to have been the pub, or they might used to have been a club that we went to, or our homes. All of a sudden, our social connections were relocated outdoors. And how about these kind of social connections? Maybe this feeling of being more embedded in our community. For me, my relationships with my immediate neighbours has absolutely blossomed in the last 18 months. And that's purely down to the kind of requirements of the pandemic to look out for the people on your doorstep. And I think this can feed into personal geographies that are underpinned by a greater feeling of being, in some sense, secure or safe. Just knowing someone nearby can help, or has got your back, or is keeping an eye out to make sure that everything's okay. So what does all of this mean for how we might act for the climate emergency? This is all nice learning from the pandemic at a local scale, but what in terms of this other big challenge that we face, which is the climate emergency? So here are a few thoughts, because ultimately, in terms of the research that I'm doing with Catherine, we're looking at this connecting up between local and global scales. So in this table here, I've got a few points that, again, link to the examples that I've been giving from a local point of view. So a local scale, how might we continue to do things differently such that our everyday actions are more sensitized to living within our one planetary boundaries? Well, we've already seen from some of the examples that I've given and you've given that the relocalization of food and drink supply chains is something that was kind of very readily embraced at the start of the pandemic. Now, interestingly, when lockdowns were released, a lot of people flocked back to their supermarkets, which is understandable for a range of reasons. However, a lot of people are stuck with their milk in glass bottles and their farm shops or their veg delivery boxes. So one of the things Catherine and I are trying to understand is, why have those things stuck, and what can we learn from that? What else have we got at local level? Well, we've been talking about appreciating and cultivating the nature on our doorstep, the importance of kind of knowing our neighbours and contributing in our neighbourhood according to our means, whether that's doing a food shop for an elderly neighbour, or just looking out for someone, making sure they're okay, asking them how they are. And at the bottom, I've added another one here, which is, it's kind of broad. Identify how something we have might fulfill someone else's needs, whether that's time, the offer of time to do something for someone. But I was thinking here also about the material side of the pandemic experience, having a good clear out, giving things away, leaving your unwanted things at your front door. So someone who would really appreciate those books to read or those toys for their child can take them and rehome them. So having identified those examples from a local level, I thought, OK, well, what does this mean at a global level, or what could this mean at a global level? So in terms of supply chains, I was thinking about how, in all of this talk that we hear about the importance of trade deals, and we're hearing a lot about this in the UK at the moment, not just because of COP26 and COVID, but Brexit as well. What a triple whammy that we have to deal with. What if we had trade deals that were based on minimising emissions? So we have trade miles. So rather than engaging in a trade deal with the furthest flung corners of the world for political reasons, and a lot of trade deals happen for political reasons, what if we looked at optimising trade miles by making those as small as possible, as local as possible? In terms of how we value nature, I mean, this is something that's already happening, the financial valuing of nature, literally putting a financial price tag on a forest, on a peat bog, or on the cost of irreversibly damaging or losing it. Now, that idea of financialising nature often doesn't sit well with people. There's a sense that we shouldn't have to put a price on nature. We should just value it because it's wonderful. That is true. But unfortunately, a lot of decision making is based on the economic value of things, or the economic cost of using them or not using them. So if a way to safeguard nature is putting another kind of value on it, a monetary value on it, rather than just we value it because we recognise it as important, then maybe that's something that we need to be seeing more of at a global level. It'll be interesting to see whether anything like that comes out of COP26 in the next few days. In terms of social connection, I think a lesson here that is really useful to take forward is about providing targeted support for action. So enabling people to take action and get support at the level and in the context that they need. And to me, this really sits with the idea of common but differentiated responsibility, which might be something that, depending on the subjects that you study, you might have thought something about. And what this means in essence is that everyone has a responsibility to do something, to play some part, but the amount of responsibility you take is different depending on your circumstances. So not everyone has got the means to buy an electric car. However, other people who don't have the means to buy an electric car probably do have the means to maybe eat meat slightly less often during the week. So everyone is making a contribution, but those contributions are different. And then my last point about how we can fulfill someone else's needs by materially redistributing things that we no longer need. You might have heard of the idea of a circular economy. It's something that has gained quite a lot of traction in recent years in the context of thinking through how we can minimise the amount of waste that comes out of our production systems, keeping materials in use for longer by designing them in ways that they can be easily broken down into their constituent parts and remade either into the same product or something else. So I think there are things that we are doing and we have learnt on the back of the pandemic, things that we recognise as being kind of truly important to our quality of life, that we can learn from to feed into global action for the climate emergency. Now, it's important to recognise that we can't all do everything, but we can all do something. And this comes back to my point a moment ago about common but differentiated responsibility. And so one of the things that I'm exploring at the moment alongside my research with Catherine is about how we can get young people's voices heard and young people's action enabled more effectively around action on the climate emergency. So I have one more poll for you. I'm just going to make this one live. OK, so this is a multiple choice. You can tick as many of these as you like. What I'm really interested to get a sense of is how many of these statements you relate to, because I'm working on scoping out, setting up something like, we've not got a name for it yet, a young person's citizen assembly, or something like that, a young people's, a youth climate assembly maybe. There are things like this in different parts of the country, so depending on where you're joining us from this afternoon, I know down in Winchester, down on the south coast, they've launched something like this recently, and I saw someone post about this on a social media channel, and I thought this would be an amazing thing for us to have in the Chester area. So if you're in the Chester area, but even if you're not, wherever in the country you are, I would really love to know which of these statements you feel apply to you. So I can be sure if I'm working with people across the area, I'm looking to work with young people to inform this as well, how we can make a group, a forum, an assembly, whatever we call it, something that fulfills your needs and the way that you want to act on the climate emergency. If you have any other ideas on that, or if you want to tell me something about that idea that doesn't sit in any of those boxes, I would love to hear from you. My email address is on the screen. If you want to know any more about the idea of a youth assembly, if you've got any questions that I don't get a chance to answer today about this talk, please just get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to remind everyone that poll just then is just the same link that we sent earlier on. So if you are filling in the poll that we were just talking about, it's just a link that's a little bit further on up in the chat that Stacey posted earlier. So yeah, as Rebecca was saying, if you would like to ask any questions, then now is the time, and I will just check with Stacey for any of the ones that actually already came through throughout your talk. Thank you very much. So Stacey.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Rebecca. This has been really interesting. I've had a couple of questions in to start with. First one is it fair to expect people who have found the pandemic really difficult to take on the responsibility for responding to the climate emergency?
Yeah, look, the question of fairness or equity is one that I think, well, it's come out in both contexts, in the pandemic and in the climate emergency. Undoubtedly, COVID-19 has been incredibly difficult for a whole range of people for a whole range of reasons. And I think I guess what we're trying to do with our research is not place a burden of responsibility on anyone to act in any particular way. It's the opposite. It's saying the way that everyone has had to respond to the pandemic, in whatever circumstances that has been, there might have been environmental gains that you're unaware of accidentally. So this isn't about necessarily asking people to come and do something else in response to the climate emergency. It's saying you might already be doing things, and we're just keen to work out what they are. There are all kinds of inequalities, particularly social and economic inequalities, that make it a lot harder for a lot of people to even engage with the idea of the climate emergency. So in terms of responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, the responsibility needs to lie with the people who are having the greatest impact. And those are often the people who are not in the most kind of marginalised or challenging social and economic situations.
That's great, thank you. We have another question. If national governments are unlikely to take the bold steps needed at COP26, do you think that makes it easier or more difficult for action to come from more local levels?
I don't think it necessarily makes a huge amount of difference what is going to come out of COP26 from a national government action. Obviously, I hope to see bold action that moves us very swiftly towards net zero. But I think one of the things, again, that the last 18 months has shown is just how quickly and effectively action can materialise and have significant impact at a local scale. So I think people who want to see change locally can and will self-organise regardless. I think it's a real shame that sort of in the last 10 years or so, a lot of support structures that had been enabled by previous governments around things like acting on climate change and acting for sustainability have dried up. They haven't been recent government's priority. So things like that could really help amplify and make things bigger and increase in scope. But I don't think that is needed to get stuff happening in the first place.
That's great. We've just had another one come through. How would you suggest young people take action so that they feel that their voices are being heard?
Brilliant question. I would say that the place to start is to think about which aspects of this you are most passionate about in your heart, because there are so many different dimensions to this. Is your real passion to do with safeguarding wildlife and biodiversity? Is your real passion to do with frustration about the fashion industry and fast fashion? Is your real passion to do with food and food insecurity? I think if you follow your particular passion to find organisations that are active in that area, then getting directly involved with organisations, often kind of charities and NGOs, a lot of them will have their own kind of youth assemblies or kind of youth wings. And even if they don't, they're really keen to have anyone of any age involved. So I would say identify, first of all, what your real passion is, and then find the organisations that are already doing work in that area. There are plenty out there, all really, really keen to have more people get stuck in.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. That's all the questions for now. I'll hand back over to Zoe.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. That was a really good question. And I just wanted to say, whilst I was here, that although social media isn't great for some things, it is really good for this kind of stuff at the moment. You'll be able to find things that you're passionate about, things that are going on in the area, and know that we like to share things on our Twitter, and you guys do. So I've just put our Twitter handles in the chat for everyone, because I know that the department share quite a lot of interesting stuff, and we also try and retweet all of your stuff as well. So if you just want to have a look at that, if there's anything that you'd like to know, we always try and get involved with things. So I just wanted to thank you very much, Rebecca, for that. That was a great talk. It was great to hear from you. We always like to come to these sessions because we get to learn things ourselves as well. So I'm glad that we had some people here today to enjoy it with us. And also, I just wanted to say that if there is anything else that we can help you with, please take a look at our outreach pages on the University of Chester website. Stacey is going to pop some of those things into the chat for you, just some of the links to our resources. She'll also pop the links to the next of our events that are coming up as well, and also just to the departmental page if you've got any more information that you want to find out about that. And lastly, I'd just like to thank you for coming as well, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our next events. So from the team here, thank you very much, unless anybody else has got anything else that they would like to end on today. We all okay? Perfect. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.